offloading sense making to any system requires incredible trust and faith in the developers of the code base of that system. How is that trust maintained?
So here, I think, again, I'll refer to concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, what I'd like to do is call out the concepts that were used by Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Foucault mostly on what he calls the societies of discipline. And Deleuze calls out something he calls the societies of control.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like to point to is that we have a default, still a default sense that is the sense of the societies of discipline, which has to do with uh, siloing.
Mm-hmm.
He calls them disciplinary institutions. So, for example, an engineering class, so that a given individual would perhaps be categorized as an engineer, and
Mm-hmm.
a cluster of engineers might be considered the engineering department.
Mm-hmm.
And then the engineering department might have a relationship with, say, the marketing department and the finance department, right? So you have these
Mm-hmm.
homogenous groups that are composed of specialized homogenous individuals that have relationships through group to group boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
That's a disciplinary institution. In the context of what Deleuze refers to as control, that set of basic ontological characteristics is no longer present. So a given individual is not an engineer, although a given individual might participate more than others in
Mm-hmm.
tasks that are of the kind engineering.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good answer.
All right. So therefore, every individual has as a primary basis physical relationality.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a strong amount of actual time spent in your embodied state,
Mm-hmm.
relating with other human beings who are quite distinct from the activities that you engage in your virtual state,
Mm-hmm.
and doing all sorts of very nice physical human embodied stuff like growing food
Mm-hmm.
and dancing and things like
Mm-hmm.
that, but with continuity of relationship, right? Not with strangers or weak bond relationships, but with strong bond relationships, what we would call a proper community.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so this is one, there's two, but that's one. This creates a much stronger basis for trust because you will have awareness. People will actually have awareness of the specifics of a given individual,
Mm-hmm.
the Dunbar style intimacy, awareness of the specific context of an individual. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Where are they right now? Where's their health and well being? And the individual will have a value structure. And very much you're speaking to some assumptions around anthropology and the evolution of how mind works,
Mm-hmm.
that is grounded in these sort of an externalized sense of self, which is to say, will down regulate the degree to which atomized egoic choices will be dominating their choice making infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Then the second mode that individuals will be spending time in are in these commoning relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These commoning relationships will create a continuous introspection on their own interior, which is to say, taking responsibility for a greater and greater degree of capacity to make choices that are effective. And I'm here specifically referring to it in the way that Forrest Landry describes it, which involves collaborative healing, individuals supporting each other in continuously healing the aspects of themselves that inhibit their capacity to make effective choices,
Mm-hmm.
and an orientation towards the sort of the fundamental notion of the sacred or the wholeness that is greater than self, greater than your smaller or lesser self. This is a second mode or second style of how individuals can be made more fluid in the ways that they're actually able to um, guide their choices,
Mm-hmm.
and also a second order way that presence of particular events that are happening in the social field will be more widely distributed, not captured inside small cabals, small groups.
Mm-hmm.
So now all of that sits in the context of then how is the design process actually delivered?
Mm-hmm.
The design process is a social activity, meaning everyone participates. Um, some might participate more than others, but
Mm-hmm.
everyone in the conception that I put forth. So, as a good concrete example, uh, everyone is provisioned with the sort of the design tokens, which they
Mm-hmm.
use as their sort of civic responsibility to allocate to the designs that they feel are the most valuable.
The
And
proposals is the word. Are you referring to the proposals for projects?
yes, just to
Okay.
recapitulate, there were three aspects to that. One was a proposal,
Mm-hmm.
which identifies an objective value.
Yes.
We
Mm-hmm.
should do this. The second was designs, which articulate specifications for how one might respond to that proposal.
Mm-hmm.
And the third was individuals raising their hands to actually have solved the problem or
All
proposing
right.
to do so.
All right. Thank you for clarifying.
And tokens can be allocated across all three. So I could allocate to simply a proposal saying, yes, this is valuable, but
Mm-hmm.
ambiguous. Or I can allocate to a specification, a design at many levels of abstraction, i.e., to a whole design or to a particular piece of a design. Or I can, in fact, choose to say, yes, this particular suggestion to open it, to activate the design, to solve the design,
Mm-hmm.
is greenlit to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The third is not a token allocation, but it's a secondary effect of token allocations.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a civic duty. Right? So the expectation is that everybody has these, and everybody's engaged in that to some level. And all of this, of course, is happening at the level of the objective objective. It is happening in public and happening in an open, transparent way. So everyone
Mm-hmm.
has the ability to observe what's happening. Okay, so that's the answer to the question, broadly speaking. And so the hope, and of course we have um, how do we say this? Once you begin the process of actually doing something, you rapidly begin to explore a very large number of things that you had no notion of before you began doing it.
Mm-hmm.
We can say with some confidence that the closure of particular subsets as a consequence of complexity and as a consequence of potential speciation of paradigmatic models will likely happen. You know, even just the phrase that I just said is an example of itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I used a certain amount of semantic complexity to describe something. By definition, some large fraction of the human population will not have access to understanding what I just said.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a sort of a subset or a subculture who has
Mm-hmm.
that. Take blockchain and smart contracts is already a subchain, a subculture. So we
Mm-hmm.
have an ability, a necessity that the resourcing of activities that are happening in the design mode is general. But in reality, there will definitely be something that we might call specialization or gilding, which has to do with people who are holding particular competence and what do they call them? Vernaculars that will narrow the affordability of certain potentially large portions of the population to actually understand what's going on inside the black box.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the initial propositions, and interestingly enough, I was actually having a conversation with a group about this exact issue yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
is we can imagine a number of meta propositions that come up quite quickly. This relates very much to the notion of meta psychotechnologies. Right? The
Mm-hmm.
level of meta is very important. Spirituality as a meta discipline, as I described in my most recent Substack article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's say I have a group that is working on, let's just make a simple example, a general purpose AI.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So at a meta level, I would have a noticing that that's super dangerous. Right? And so what I
Yeah.
would need to have is a meta process that is actually able to identify specifications that are in the category of super dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
therefore would have a series of mechanisms built in to ensure, quote unquote, right, using the larger context of Civium, that everyone involved in this particular process, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to figure out how to do no notifications, but I haven't figured that out on a PC or on a desktop. Um,
And so to clarify, you personally view a general AI as something that is likely to have second order effects. That's your example, correct?
Yes, likely
Okay.
to have what you call significant second order effects.
Okay.
Intensity is important. Everything has second order effects, but intensity is the key.
Oh yeah, yeah, and negative second order effects because there can be positive cascades as well.
Sure, absolutely. We'd like to focus on as many of those as possible.
Yes, if we could only have positive cascades, society would work really well.
Right. So you can imagine that as a very basic element of uh, the set of protocols associated with the design aspect, the design mode, would be a sort of a meta process that evaluates the probability of negative intensity second order effects of any given effort, and therefore provides a series of um,
What the hell?
inputs. What happened? Are we okay?
Sorry, something just started playing in my background. Sorry, go on.
Uh, and therefore, we would have a series of mechanisms to check in on and ensure that that particular process does not uh, generate those negative second order effects.
Mm-hmm.
Now, examples, though, and this is why I wanted to go back to the first part of the answer. Many of those examples would go to things like how do we make sure that the people, the humans that are involved in the process, are mature enough to actually take responsibility for the magnitude of the process they're actually taking responsibility for.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
here again, I want to make use of our previous concepts. For the most part, and particularly in the United States in the second half of the 20th century, we made what I would say is a category error in how we tried to address risk, which was we tried to address risk through process. And we created epicycles after epicycles of more and more process. So, for example, if you look at the context of law,
Mm-hmm.
we tried to address the risk of, say, for example, bias or prejudice or racism
Mm-hmm.
by layering on additional levels of objective process.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a benefit to that. It can work. It has certain advantages, but it has a lot of disadvantages, not the least of which is um, there's an entropic barrier that eventually purely objective process will ultimately be routed around by any subjective activity and it will ultimately fail.
Mm-hmm.
And the second order effect is that it also has the consequence of displacing and reducing actual embodied wisdom and maturity.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a whole bunch of immature individuals sort of what's this called, scaffolded or crutched by an objective process. And once the objective process reaches the levels of its ability to actually manage the risk flows over the dam, but the people behind it no longer have the capacity to actually respond to anything, which is a very good explanation for why the culture war is behaving the way that it's behaving right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what we would want to do is we want to actually go the opposite direction and do things like ensure that the individuals who are stepping into a particular process have the level of wisdom and the level of maturity that is adequate to the level of responsibility that is embodied or embedded in the particular design that they're acting on. And there's a whole chunk of that. Fortunately, we can look to both guilds and to indigenous communities as examples of how this sort of thing has been done many times in the past.
Mm-hmm. I okay. So in your answer, at some point you mentioned civic duty, and why is the concept of a social contract where rights are declared and civic duties are declared? Why is that the right framing? I've recently had conversations with people who sort of said that sort of implies a physical force to enforce the concept of rights, and there are other ways to frame ways to come together. So, why is continuing with the social contract framing, even if it's altered a little, why is that the right approach to creating a new system?
Hmm. So maybe I'll back up. The phrase civic duty is more in the mode of vernacular. So I'm not sure if I'm actually
Okay.
importing that whole social contract language.
You're just using language that already exists to try to explain ideas that are coming up. Yeah, that happens.
Right, exactly. So let's see what is meant, and then see if I say it with more specificity, if it still raises the same question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the notion is actually coming from the place closer to um, what I used as the objective objective, and at the basis of the objective objective. So it's more like um, if you want to live, you will also need to breathe and eat.
Okay.
Characteristics of the intrinsic nature of the way the world works.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say that you have a responsibility is more along the lines of saying, to the degree to which this is a thing,
Mm-hmm.
human beings will undertake this as part of how they live their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So it's less to do with the notion of we are entering into an agreement as humans,
Mm-hmm.
but rather that we are choosing as individuals to participate in reality according to reality.
Mm-hmm. That's a good clarification. Thank you.
Using a bit of the language from my most recent Substack, we might say that it is a spiritual commitment.
It's interesting because I feel like you talk a lot in a way where it's like we get into a frame of being and experience a conscious state, which I have also experienced with people and functionally alone. Um, it's like it's an embodied way to relate to people, and it is challenging to maintain. It's like it wants to break. I don't know. There's something about the way that people interrelate that just wants to break back down into really base level thought or monkey energy. I don't know.
I
But I
think I know
love,
what you mean.
yeah, I love the way you frame it as like sort of a lived state of being and less focus on the technology itself, even though that is so essential and so frames it so much.